Welcome, everybody. Today what we're going to do is we have several more of these apologetics things where I'm going to be talking about Kristi Burkes in critiques of the Bible. She lists about 7 Bible verses that she says were instrumental in her leaving Christianity. And she now has a very popular website basically bashing Christianity and explaining to people why they shouldn't trust the Bible, because the God of the Bible is immoral, he's evil, and therefore feel free to reject that particular God. All right? So we've gone through the majority of the verses, just one verse left that she has trouble with. And that, believe it or not, is John 3:16. So she's going to go into a tirade on how John 3:16 does not reveal a loving God. But before she does that, this is the preamble to her complaints of John 3:16. She's going to recap all the things, the other verses that she hates. So this is an opportunity to kind of briefly recap all of her big verses that, wow. So, if you're a young Christian and you experience somebody like Kristi Burke, who comes along and has been in the faith, if you will, longer than you, who is familiar with the Bible, maybe more, because there's a lot of young Christians in 2024. A lot of people came to Christ in 2024. Bible sales in 2024 went up 20%, showing you that for whatever reason, maybe it was all the evil in the world, maybe it was partly the Chosen series, I don't know, but God is doing something, and more people are coming to faith. That means there are a lot of young believers out there, and if you don't know your Bible and somebody like her comes along, it can derail your faith. I remember as a young Christian myself, when I went to college and took my first Bible literature class, I was intellectually devastated because they talk about these verses that she's discussing. I think they're important to discuss because this is what you get in college. You go to college, you take a Bible class, you take a history class. It is antagonistic towards Christianity. And when they want to stomp on the Bible, these are verses that they're going to use to show you you cannot trust the Bible. The God of the Old Testament is immoral and evil, and therefore throw the whole thing out. Feel free to chuck the whole thing. How dare the Bible come along and tell you that your morality isn't good enough? You don't have to listen to that book because it's full of crap. All right? So she kind of recaps something. So I'm going to go through that. We're going to briefly recap what we've talked about already, and then we'll dive into some of her new complaints. All right? So let's get started.
And I can appreciate this as a book that is a commentary on the struggles of people at that time, written by men. But I cannot accept this as some kind of divinely inspired word of God meant to provide a moral code for all people on earth. And the last verse that I want to bring up that I think was very, very crucial in my deconstruction was probably the most famous verse in the Bible. And that's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave up his only son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but will have everlasting life. And most people point to this and they say, how could you find fault in that? How could you have a problem with that? Look at the love. All you have to do is believe. Do you see how easy that is? But let's break it down just a little bit. Let's deconstruct John 3:16. For God so loved the world. So first of all, considering the other verses we've talked about, I don't think that's accurate. I don't think God so loved the world. I don't think God loved all of those surrounding cities of the nation of Israel that he was commanding Israel to go and kill or enslave.
So she says, well, no, that's not right. So she's pointing out that he doesn't love everybody because, look, God told Israel to exterminate certain groups when they went into Canaan. Now, for one thing, if she's going to create this net God, she's going to assume that God so loved the world, that means he loves everybody no matter what they do or think. For God so loved the world, does that mean blanket love that's unconditional no matter what? No, the answer is no. That's not the kind of unconditional love God is offering here. So that is clear by the rest of Scripture and by the rest of what Jesus says. So her interpretation of that God wants everybody to say yes. Is everybody willing to? Not unless he arrests their free will, and he's not willing to do that. So if he's not willing to suspend free will, then there are going to be people who are going to do some unlovely things. That's how it is. Okay. Now the first thing she points out is, let's go back and when Deuteronomy 20, when God tells the children of Israel to go into the land of Canaan, and it describes the Perizzites and the Hivites and all those guys. These are individuals who live in the hill country. And as we mentioned before, the hill country is where the giants are. Okay. It's where the Rephaim are. but it mentions, these are groups that are to be wiped out. Now, what about those other groups? What about those human populations? So there's no Rephaim blood. What about the human populations that live near the Rephaim? What about those guys? What do you do to them? It doesn't say wipe them out. What it says instead, it says, when you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And if it agrees to make peace and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor to serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike the men in it with the edge of the sword. However, the women, the children, the animals, and everything in the city, all of its spoils, you shall take as plunder for yourself. And you shall use the spoils of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. This is what you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. And the nations nearby were the nations with the Rephaim. Okay? Now, it sounds terrible. It's like, oh my gosh, those humans that if they try to fight you, or even if they don't fight you, they're going to end up, either the men are going to end up getting wiped out in war, and the women and children are going to get enslaved no matter what. That sounds horrible. Now, keep in mind, these tribes have been influenced by the hill people, by these people, and they are guilty of some pretty bad things. And God said to sterilize those populations because as a culture, the Canaanites were committing the sins of idolatry, temple prostitution, adultery, homosexuality, incest, murder, bestiality, gang rape, and lots of child sacrifice. God was very disgusted with that. Okay, so they were guilty of they were ritualistically engaging in these practices. Okay.
As bad as it gets.
That's as bad as it gets. Exactly. And we talked about, we have archaeological evidence supporting the Bible's claims that this child sacrifice was going on. We found the altars. We found the bodies. Okay. So we know this is what happens. Now, in this liberal culture, in this anti-Christian culture, it's infuriating. The revisionist history that goes, if we didn't have the physical evidence, they would completely deny that this ever happened. Oh, the Israelites just said that to justify stealing their land. Look for, I went to bed last night. I had YouTube going and it kept going from thing to thing. So I woke up and they were talking about the Aztecs. Now I know Aztec history pretty well. I've taught about the Aztecs. Okay. I don't want to do that all over again here, but the Aztecs were doing some pretty nasty things. Exactly. When Cortez came upon them, all right, they were, they got along great. And then they saw their ritualistic human sacrifice, where they cut the heart out of a guy while he's still alive, and then throw the body down the pyramid, and they go one after the other, and that was a big thing. And then the blood, that whole pyramid was like drenched in blood because they were sacrificing so many people. So Cortez and his men interrupted that. That set off a bomb. Up until then, Cortez and the Aztecs got along great, but when Cortez's men saw this, they were like, this is evil. Okay, you guys are not cool at all. I mean, this is abhorrent. And they stopped. They stopped it. Okay, so now I know that. I talked about that before, right? So how did the History Channel interpret that? Cortez and his men interrupted a special religious service. And that's what started the problems, because they interrupted one of their sacred services. No mention of human sacrifice. Not a peep. And you look at it and going, look at the bias. If Christians had done something like that, do you think that would have been omitted? If Christians had been involved in witch burning and some pagans had come along and stopped them, do you think that the History Channel would have reported that these pagans interrupted one of the Christians' spiritual services, one of their sacred rites? No, they would have absolutely. The bias is just horrible. So I'm very happy that we have physical evidence of what was going on. Okay, and even with the physical evidence, they still tried to deny this. So anyway, now as we mentioned before, at the Tower of Babel, God divided up the nations of the earth, the nations of the people, and He assigned angelic rulers to kind of direct them to help these people with basic construction skills, farming, how to make clothes, stuff like that, basic morality, and so forth. That's what they were supposed to do. What did many of them do instead? They directed worship towards themselves, and because they resented that man is going to inherit the earth, that man is going to be the new B'nai Elohim, the new sons of God, instead of directing mankind to worship God and to obeying good moral laws, they told them the polar opposite. One of the biggest rules that God gave Noah when Noah landed and Noah made that first sacrifice, God said, here are the rules. Be fruitful and multiply, and if somebody kills man, by man he must be killed. Human life is sacred. So what did they do? The opposite. Don't harm the innocent. Kill the babies. Murder the babies in sacrifice. Throw them in the fire. Okay, I mean, they just made this ritual. Human sacrifice became a thing, and so all kinds of sexual perversions. They made it a part of the religion. They did the exact opposite. So these people were doing really disgusting things. Now, when these people were divided up, God said that Jacob is mine, Israel is mine. So all these different angels get different parts of the world. So every nation group was given angelic rulership, but Israel was God's. And so presumably Baal, Moloch, Anath, Ashtoreth could actually have been angelic beings. They could have actually existed as rulers in Canaan. Okay? So I don't know if any of these were made up or if they were all real. We don't know. But the bottom line is that there is a likelihood that they actually existed, and they were disgusting. They told their followers the worst. I mean, they were just downright satanic in terms of the values that they employ. And then you have their offspring, which are the Rephaim. Those are their offspring, and they were like moving things along and encouraging these horrible behaviors. And so when the Israelites came through, their job was to wipe out the Rephaim. They are the instigators of this. They are the children of these rebellious angels. They are literally the offspring of the enemies of God. Okay, they are part human, but they are part angel. All right, and they are encouraging these disgusting behaviors. That's why the Rephaim were to be exterminated. Get their genes out of the human gene pool. These angels were going, oh, well, you said humans will inherit the earth. Well, we can be human. And this is God saying, no, I didn't intend earth for you. I told you not to mate with humans. I didn't make earth for angels. I made earth for humans. So he says, I want you to exterminate them. All right. Now, could God have used pestilence like he did with the Mesoamericans, where he just brought disease in? And, because of some of the behaviors. Now, I'm not saying that all the Mesoamericans deserve to die by smallpox. I'm not saying that at all. But we had some cultures, such as the Aztecs, that were doing some pretty evil things. And the more you look at Aztec culture, they rejected Quetzalcoatl as their god, which was a friendly god, which looks like it's one of the good angels. And they chose Huitzilopochtli instead, which was the god that loved violence, war, and human sacrifice. All right. They chose that as a culture. So he could have wiped them out like that, but he didn't. He said, he used Israel as his arm to wipe these guys out. So there are 4 reasons why God wiped these guys out. They were practicing many things that were abominations to God, such as incest and infanticide. The people of Israel were God's chosen project. From them, the Messiah would be born, and he wanted a culture that would support those biblical values and not be influenced by the religion of the Canaanites. Because, as you know, that Canaanite religion was very infectious. Notice how when Israel had kings, most of them, what was their primary sin? Going after the gods of the Canaanites. Abandoning Yahweh and going after and worshiping like the Canaanites. Going back to child sacrifice and stuff like that. That's why God wanted the Rephaim. He wanted these people. He wanted this influence expunged. Okay? So the Nephilim needed to be destroyed. The Anakim or the Rephaim needed to be destroyed. And these guys, they were not going to let the Israelites peacefully coexist. That wasn't on the table. So there are a number of reasons why he commanded the killing of some of the Canaanites. So she says, her argument is there's no excuse for that. Well, actually there is, as I just mentioned.
I don't think God loved all of the women and children that God was commanding them to take as plunder and do with whatever they wanted.
Now, what she's implying is, the Israelites took those, of the human populations, not the Rephaim, but of the human populations. Let's say they chose to fight. Now, if the men surrender, if they said, we've heard of you Israelites, we heard what happened to the Egyptians. We heard about that. We heard about what happened at Jericho. So we're familiar with your God. We surrender. Okay, you get to keep your families and everything. Come on in. You're going to work for us for a while. Okay, but then you're absorbed into our tribe. While you're with us, though, you have to obey these laws. You are no longer allowed to sacrifice your children. You're no longer allowed to practice temple prostitution or these immoral behaviors. So we are forcing you to live our way against your will, and you will serve us for a time. Now, when she says this, she's thinking, it's slavery, just like in the American South. Okay? You're going to be a slave for life, and we're going to sexually abuse you and beat you whenever we want, and it's going to be a life of oppression and depression. So that's what you think of when you think of slavery. Well, actually, that's not. The Mosaic law is very clear about slavery. But what are the Mosaic rules for slavery? Well, I've got a few of them. Number 1, can't keep them longer than 7 years. After 7 years, either they choose to move away and find their own land somewhere, or you bring them into your tribe. They become Jews. So that's what happens after 7 years. So it's 7-year sentence. Okay. Number 2, here's the big one. If they run away, you're not allowed to go get them. You start beating your slaves, treating them poorly. If they leave, you can't go get them. There was one example in the Old Testament there. Was it 1 Samuel? 1 or 2 Samuel? I forgot which one. Where one of the guys that abused David, when Solomon took over, this guy he'd done some bad things, and David chose not to go after him. Solomon wasn't so forgiving. So he put the guy under house arrest. He says, okay, look, dude, I'm going to let you live. What you did was inexcusable, but I'm going to let you live. Okay, but you're under house arrest. You leave the area, you leave Jerusalem, and all bets are on. So what happened was the guy was cool for about 3 years, and then a couple of his slaves ran away. They ran away to the land of the Philistines. He went after them. Okay, he got his slaves and brought them back, and Solomon found out about it. And when he came back, he says, okay, guess what? You're no longer forgiven, and there are 2 reasons why you're going to be executed. Number 1, you broke the command to the Lord, because it was a command that if a slave runs away, you are not allowed to come back in. And number 2, he broke your word to me, because I told you and you agreed that you were under house arrest, and you left anyway. So for these 2 reasons, you're going to die. And he was executed that day. Okay. This was a very serious law. If you mistreat a slave such that they run away, you can't go get them. Yeah.
Were the slaves aware of the scripture against people going after them if they escape?
It'd be kind of hard to keep that sort of thing secret, don't you think? Yeah. That'd be very difficult to keep that a secret. Okay. All right. So by bringing them into the Israeli tribe, you're essentially forcing them to stop these evil practices that they learned from the Rephaim and now adopt a godly view. And so for them and their children, okay? Most were absorbed in the Jewish family over time. Rape of slaves, as defined by, if you try to rape a slave, all right, and they scream out, that's the death penalty. That's punishable by death. So you forfeit your life if you do that. So it's not like, the American South, where you can do whatever you want and you have slave and they're your property for life and you can abuse them. No. And so that's what she was implying. You can take the plunder, do whatever you want with them. No, you can't do whatever you want with them if you want to live.
I don't think he was loving the women that he was forcing into marriage with men that assaulted them.
So we talked about this one last week, all right? If you have, she basically, what she's doing is she's referring to that verse over there that says if a woman is unbetrothed and a man has sex with her, then he must pay her father 50 shekels of silver and he must marry her. Okay. And she looks at that and says, well, he's raped her. So if you see a hot girl and she's not engaged, you can rape her and she has to be your wife. What a great way to get a wife. And so that's her interpretation, that's what God is intending by that verse. Okay, so we got to take that apart. We talked about this last time, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important, I think, that we cover this for those that didn't see the last week program there. All right, so for one thing, most of the children, by the time they reach puberty, are already betrothed. The custom was between the ages of around 8 and puberty, all right, 8 and 12, 8 and 13. The job of the parents, the father has to say, okay, you know what? I got my friend Bob over here. He's got a son, Tom, and you're going to marry our daughter, Betty, and why don't we hook up and then our families will become one, and you're a good family, we're a good family. How about it? And then if the families agree, they're betrothed, whether they meet each other or not. That's how marriages were arranged, okay? And then they bonded, they made it work. That's how it worked. So by the time you were in puberty, you were betrothed. It was very rare for a young girl to be puberty or older and not be betrothed. So why wouldn't a daughter be betrothed? Because it's talking about unbetrothed daughters. Why wouldn't they be betrothed by then? Well, there are several reasons. Could be that dad is widowed. His wife is gone and he doesn't have any friends. He's very antisocial. So he never got around to picking a spouse for his daughter. Okay, so that's a possibility. That dad could be physically ill or mentally ill. That's a possibility. Parents might have a personality disorder. Nobody's good enough for our daughter. And so they reject every offer because they can't find anybody good enough. Dad or mom is a single parent, and I see this a lot. And the daughter is their only source of support. She's cooking my food, milking the cow, washing the dishes, bringing me my beer. I don't want to give her up. I mean, I don't have other close family, and I don't want to give her up. So I'm not giving her to nobody. She's mine. That happens. I've seen both mothers and fathers abuse their children. And every time that kid comes home with a potential suitor, they do everything they can to sabotage the relationship. I see that all the time, all the time. It's really sad. It's very sad because when that parent dies, that kid is now 50 years old, and that's it. It's over. It's very sad. Or the parents and the daughter can just have like handicap or be homely, and nobody wants them. That's another possibility. So those are some reasons, and so you have this daughter here. Let's say you have a daughter, though, who's not homely. She has a suitor, somebody wants her, but the dad says, nope, you're going to stay here and make my breakfast and milk them cows and wash them dishes, girl. You ain't going nowhere. I'm not giving you to nobody. That boy ain't good enough for you. What about that poor kid? Well, what if the Bible said something like this? Any woman who is not betrothed by their parents must remain a spinster until the death of her father. Now, when I first did this, I didn't tell you that wasn't in the Bible, okay? But that's the reaction when I last week when I read that as though it was a Bible verse. Everybody goes, what does that say about God? That he has no regard for that girl. That's what it suggests, that he devalues this girl. You have to be the slave of your dad. So when it comes to whose rights matter more, the parent or the daughter, clearly God would be saying, I favor the dad. The dads are more important than daughters. That's what that verse would be saying. But that's not what verse 25 says. Instead, it says, suppose a man has intercourse with a young woman who is a virgin but not engaged to be married. If they are discovered, he must pay her father 50 pieces of silver. Then he must marry the young woman because he violated her, and he may never divorce her as long as he lives. Well, divorce, that's what marriage is. You don't divorce. Okay. But the thing is that tells you, okay, this gives the girl an out. Now, how do you know this is not talking about rape? Because in this book, anytime rape is managed, it is defined as this guy is going on her, right? And she's screaming. And it doesn't matter if she screams in the country and nobody hears, or in the city and people hear. If she screams, that's rape. And you know what the guy gets if it's rape? He gets death. That's the penalty for rape. This is not talking about rape. There's no screaming involved. All right. So this passage is a way to help all of those young women who have a suitor but are not allowed to get married because their parents like the free help. Okay. Who wouldn't like a servant? And God is saying, no, if she has a suitor, it's okay. She needs to get married. She needs to be able to, to leave her parents and cleave to her spouse. That is more important to me than the parents getting free held. Okay. So she really twisted that verse around by calling it rape. And whatever translation she used, that's a bad translation. Okay. It literally says if you lay hands on a woman to have sex with her, it's like that's not necessarily aggressive because you can't have sex with somebody without your hand. Okay. All right. So anyway, I said that already. So there you go. So now you might not have a great relationship with your father-in-law like that. However, the poor woman has a way to actually have a family of her own. So we just debunked her 3 primary verses for saying that there's no way this could be justified. There's no way these verses can be justified. God is immoral no matter how you look at it. Wrong. And your lack of scholarship and lack of preparation does not validate, throwing God into the trash because of these verses.
I'm not seeing the love God has for the world in that. So right off the bat, I feel like we're lying here. Okay. God so loved the world, okay, that he gave up his only son. Now this is loaded because it's his son, but it's also him, depending upon what you believe or which denomination you're a part of, or even which time frame you came out of. Because in the very earliest days, people did not believe that Jesus was God. They believed Jesus was God's son, perhaps adopted into the kingdom by God, or he was given some kind of a divine status at birth. But it actually took a very long time for Christians to actually believe that Jesus was God himself. That was doctrine that evolved and was created later on.
Okay, I cannot let that go. Oh my gosh. When she said that, I about fell out of my chair. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you said that. I cannot believe you dug down and pulled that out of the bottom of your purse there. Okay, so let's take that apart. All right, man. All right, when she said that, I was like, okay, I'm getting emotional here. So I was going back to like Gnostic. Well, yeah, if you want to go all the way back, you can say, yeah, that certainly had roles in Gnosticism. Certainly Gnostics were something, but even Gnostics had a higher view of God than that. Yeah, okay. So where does that come from? Because this is the type of thinking, exactly the type of thinking that was taught in the Bible is Lit class in college. And across colleges, across this country, this is how the Bible is presented, that this whole thing, Jesus didn't originally claim to be God. All of the claims to divinity happened much later. The church, the Catholics, got together and made this part up. In fact, they also made up all of these miracles. That didn't really happen. Those were added later. Now, where did that come from? Well, so what she's saying here is Matthew, John, Peter, Luke, all those disciples were all like Jehovah's Witnesses. They did not believe Jesus was God. Jesus is a non-eternal created agent of God, maybe the son of God. God kind of adopted him, says, oh, you're special, so I'm going to call you my son. But he wasn't really God. He doesn't answer prayers, okay? He's not to be given the reverence that we would give to God because he's a created thing, all right? Maybe a great angel, but he's not God. And then later, the divine status was applied by the church. Now, as far as I can tell, if you go and look, so where did this particular idea originally come from? It goes back to Hermann Samuel Reimarus. All right. And what did Hermann Samuel, he was from Germany. He was born in 1694, died in 1768. He's a German philosopher. And he's the father of this type of criticism. Okay. Now, the historicity of Jesus was never in question during the first 1,000 years. If you look at the history books from that, nobody questioned whether or not Jesus really existed. Around the world, even Jesus' enemies agreed to this. There was no question. Nobody even fought for this. Nobody thought about, oh, we need to make sure people believe that Jesus exists. It's like, that's stupid. Of course, everybody. It was like a given. Everybody knew about Jesus. All right. Now, Herman basically was assuming that the New Testament, what we have in the book of John and the Gospels and the epistles, those things, it was written like almost maybe 1,000 years after Jesus. Okay, he says, well, why would you say something like that? Because the Bible that was available to Reimarus in Germany, the earliest Bible that they had dated to the 9th century. Now, back then, they didn't have the internet. So he didn't know about what kind of books they had in the Vatican or in England. He didn't know about those guys, all right? But he knew that basically in Germany, the oldest manuscripts was from the 8th century, so 800 years after the end. So he's assuming that, Jesus was way back here in 33 AD, and here we have the church writings 800 years later. And so basically, that's plenty of time for a legend to have built up. And so we have legend stories that have evolved over time. So Jesus was like a motivational speaker, good guy, but over years, legend built up, and they added miracles and so forth. And then the Catholic Church put it all in a book 800, 1,000 years later, and this book is like, and what we see here where Jesus claimed to be God, that is just completely added based on a legend that built up after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, so that's the premise. Now here's the problem.
Say again, 100.
I know. The problem is that as Bible archaeology has advanced, and we have found younger and younger and younger books of the Bible that show that actually you don't have all this time, the German theologians never adjusted the theory. So that if you take a look at German theology schools, this was taught as gospel, even though we found earlier, they never adjusted the theory. The theory is based on a false premise, but it was never adjusted. And even today, if you go to your average state university, you're going to have this taught, in spite of the fact that the premise of the whole thought process, the premise has been disproven over and over again. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples.
Thinking was evolution.
Yeah, very similar, very similar. Okay, so we have Jesus' death around 30 to 33 AD, right? And then here's 100 AD, and then here we got the Bible written like 500 years or before. So we got plenty of time for this legend to have built up. Well, there is no 800-year gap. The Codex Sinaiticus, all right, that dates to around 320 to 350 AD. What's interesting, that's the entire New Testament. So is the Codex Vaticanus. Similar. So we have two entire Bibles that date to around 320. So around 300 years after. So we don't have 500 years. We don't have 600, 800. At most, if you look at copies of the whole New Testament, it's only 300 years. All right, so that's one thing. That's step one. So we have 300 years to evolve Jesus into a legend. Okay, all right, let's do 300. Okay, what else have we got?
It was a 19.
Now, this is Gary Habermas. Anybody familiar with him? He's he's a professor at Liberty University there. And actually, he's from Michigan. I treated his mother, actually. She was my patient, so I know him. I'm actually talked to him. So he's a really great guy. I first got introduced to Gary when I was doing my shroud research. I was one of the youngest people who actually researched the Shroud of Turin back in the 1970s. And he wrote a book actually on it. And so I collaborated with him a little bit back then. So anyway, he's going to talk about these manuscripts here.
Because it was a 19th century German liberal view, which still there's a hangover of today. And the argument goes like this. Nobody wants to blame Jesus. Jesus was a first century itinerant prophet, a really good guy, do-gooder, probably back on the farm, but he would go out and preach and just try to lead the good life and seek ye first the kingdom of God, the Sermon on the Mount, and that's Jesus. Paul is the cult leader who comes out and sings a new song, and now he's one of the Greco-Roman dying and rising gods and they want to blame it on Paul. How can Paul be the maestro that strums the song for Christianity when Paul comes to the Lord? This text is already in existence. And we already have, not just this one, the texts we have, the early creeds, they call Jesus Lord. And then, it's in a context where he's on the right hand of God. It's in a context where Messiah, Son of God, and Lord is there at the beginning, and it's pre-Pauline. Yeah, Paul's not the inventor of this. Now, as far as what the creeds are, here's the easiest way for me to think of it. Besides the earlier ... for people who couldn't write their name, another way to think of it is this. Let's say the cross is 30 AD. Let's say the earliest New Testament book is 1 Thessalonians at 50 AD. Some people put it 48, 49, and some people put the cross at 33. So like Paul Barnett, who puts it at 33, the historian, as Paul Barnett says, if that's 33 and the book's 48, that's only 15 years.
Okay, he brings up a excellent point here. Even liberal scholars say that the Pauline epistles were written in the 50s, between 50 and 55 AD. All right, that is very early. So we have in Paul's writings, he's quoting creeds that already exist. When they're calling Jesus the Christ as Lord and stuff, those are creeds that he's quoting that everybody's familiar with because the Christians are already saying this. So he's not making it up. He's actually, if you read the text, he is quoting the creeds that the apostles are saying. So what Paul is saying is that, look, he didn't make this up. I'm quoting what the apostles are saying in the church in Jerusalem. All right, and this was 15 years after the event. And nobody is questioning the Pauline epistles. Even liberal scholars will admit, when was it written? Up to 50 and 55 AD. All right. And in these epistles, we have multiple verses that support that Christ is divine, that he is God. Okay. And nobody's questioning it. So when she says, that this came around hundreds of years later, that is insanity. It's like, based on what? There is no hundreds of years. Right here, you're seeing evidence that Jesus was worshipped as God right here. 15 years. Actually, it's going to be less than 15 years because these creeds were in place before Paul wrote them down. Otherwise, these letters make no sense. Paul is quoting creeds that nobody's familiar with then. Okay? All right. 1 Corinthians 8:6. Yeah, for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. So that defines God the Father. Whom are all things, from whom are also he made everything, and for whom we exist. We exist for God the Father, and he is the reason for everything that exists, right? And one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. He made everything, and we are the purpose. How can you look at something like that and not realize that Jesus is God? He made everything, and he's the reason we exist. Is there an angel or any other being that has honors like that? And as Jesus said in John chapter 5, that I've done these things that all may honor the Son as they honor the Father in the same way. So we got tons of support for this. I'm not going to go through all these verses, but there are tons of verses in Paul's writings that support the deity of Christ. I'm saying, well, he made it up. He just made this stuff up. This is only 15 years after the fact. Can you get away with something like that? If somebody right now, tried that, let me just do another one here. So there's 15 years there. When in the Bible, when Jesus is called the rock, people anywhere Jesus is referred to as the rock, and that happens a lot in the New Testament. If you go back in the Old Testament, that is a designation for God. God is called the rock. God is called the rock. Incline your ear to me. Deliver me quickly. Be the rock of my refuge, a strong fortress to save me. There's tons of verses where God is called the rock, right? And then when you have the New Testament and Jesus is called the rock, it's like, well, which one is it? How can Jesus be the rock if God is the rock? All right. If somebody tried to start a rumor that Osama bin Laden claimed to be God, could they get away with it? If he said, I'm God and I'm going to raise 3 days after SEAL Team 6 kills me. Do you think anybody would believe it? Why not?
He's not around.
He's not around. Well, for other things, we were around. We were around. We're familiar with Osama bin Laden, okay? It was, 20 years ago? That was about, 20 years ago? I don't know. What do you forget? Yeah, about 24 years ago was 9/11, but then he was killed less time than that. But yeah, so we're going, that's really fresh in our minds, kind of. That wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that long ago at all. There is no way you're going to get away with starting a rumor of this magnitude when we, the eyewitnesses who lived through it, are still alive and kicking. You can't do it. You can't. It's impossible. All right? So, 24 years to evolve Osama into a legend, it's impossible. Now, also, think, is there any other religious leader in history, any other promotional speaker or religious leader where their followers, after they died, their followers said, you know what? It's not enough that Buddha was a religious leader, or Gandhi was a good person, or Moses was a prophet, or Muhammad was a prophet, or Confucius was a leader. It's not enough that they were just leaders or promised. We want to worship them as God. Did anybody else try to make up a cult and say that their leader was God? Has that happened at any time in history? The answer is no. What is the basis of this stupid claim? The only basis of the claim is that Jesus did supernatural things, and they don't believe in anything supernatural. Therefore, it has to be fantasy. Because there is no historical basis for this claim that people make up stories and try to elevate their leader into a god. No, they don't. They do not do that. That is not human nature. Okay? We don't. Okay?
At number 5, we have the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a massive collection of manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1898. They are named after the city of Oxyrhynchus, where they were found, which was once the third largest city in Egypt. 90% of the documents were actually stuff that most of us would find quite boring, like census returns and tax assessments. But there were also texts from famous Greek writers, such as Sophocles, Sappho, Euripides, and even Aristotle. And of course, there were bits and pieces from the Greek Bible. Most important are P90, a section from John, and P104, a section from Matthew. These both date to around 150 CE and are thus the second and third earliest New Testament fragments found so far. The earliest New Testament fragment comes in at number 4. It's known as the Rylands Papyrus, or P52. It dates perhaps as early as 125 CE, which means that it was maybe created a mere 30 years after the original. It's pretty small though, containing only a few lines from John chapter 18 on each side. It was found in Egypt in 1920 and is currently on display at the University of Manchester.
Okay. This is what's significant about these papyri is the fact that they date to such an early time. All right. If you take the John Rylands manuscript that goes to 120 AD, that is about 90 years after the fact. 90 years. So, and one thing is, okay, if you take a look at the wording in the book of John from the John Rylands manuscript, it is identical to the Bible that we have today. It's identical to the Greek New Testament from other sources. So what that tells us is that there is no evidence that anybody tried to change it from 128 up until up until the Codex Sinaiticus, which was 320 AD. So there's been no change. Nobody got in there. There was no evidence that a scribe tried to alter it to make it say something different. No evidence. It appears to be the same. That is very significant. So, if the book of John, if the Bible has been saying the same message since 120 AD, is it possible that those early disciples changed it to add in the divine stuff? What is the likelihood that they could start a new rumor? It's almost impossible. That's at 90 years. I mean, think about it. Is it possible right now if somebody said Hitler rose from the dead, Hitler claimed to be God? Could anybody get away with that? No. Why? The biggest reason why that would be impossible is that my mom was alive when Hitler was alive. All right. My mom didn't say anything about him claiming to be God. All right. I had grandparents. And, bottom line is that if you tried to make up a story like that, there are still eyewitnesses. There are people in their 90s that were alive during that time. Okay? That's the reason you can't get away with a lie. You can't make up historical fallacies when the witnesses are still alive. You can't even do it when the secondhand witnesses are still alive. I'm a secondhand witness. All right? I knew people that they were, you can't do it. Because you have to wait. That's why a legend takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Because you have to make sure that all of the witnesses are gone so that your claims can't be refuted. It's virtually 90 years. There's too many people that can refute your claims. All right.
A mosaic bearing the earliest known inscription declaring Jesus is God has been unearthed in Israel. Hailed as the greatest discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls, the 1800-year-old engraving had been hidden under the floor of a prison. It also features images of fish, which experts say may reference the story of Luke 9:16, where Jesus multiplied 2 fish to feed 5,000 people.
They're saying that scientists are excited after finding this early inscription declaring Jesus is God, and they're saying it's from an 1800-year-old engraving. They dubbed it the Megiddo Mosaic, and it's 581 feet. It had reportedly adorned a private chapel in 230 AD, and it was the earliest known house of prayer.
What's also remarkable is the story of faith behind its creation. A Roman centurion, an artist, and 5 women who made this spectacular mosaic floor and a space for their worship, dedicated to God Jesus Christ.
So we know that this particular little church was destroyed around 230 AD, so it dates to around 200 AD. So, and here we have, what's interesting here is that it literally comes out and says, Jesus is God. I mean, it's literally, so she's saying, early Christians, they didn't see Jesus as God. That didn't happen till way later. And it's like, here we see, literally in stone, engraved in stone in Israel, Jesus is God. Right there. It's like, okay, your argument is getting really floppy here, okay, because that's like 200 AD. That is earlier than the Codex Sinaiticus, and where we have Christians in Jerusalem, in Israel, stating blatantly that Jesus is God.
Today we will take a look at the Alexamenos graffito. This piece of graffito, which is more commonly called graffiti, was found on some wall plaster that was discovered in 1857 on the Palatine Hill in Rome. The building where this artifact was discovered has been identified as a pedagogium, a school where slaves were taught and trained. It is thought therefore that this graffito was probably inscribed by slaves who attended the school. This building was originally built sometime around 90 AD, then later modified and then partially buried in around 200 AD. This therefore places the creation of this particular graffito to sometime during the 2nd century AD. The graffito depicts a man with a raised hand named Alexamenos, who is worshipping a crucified Jesus, who is depicted with the head of a donkey. The Roman idea of Jesus as a donkey partially originated from the incident when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday, just a few days before his crucifixion. This resulted in Christians being called Asamari, or donkey people, by pagan Romans. The 2nd century church father Tertullian also mentions this mocking association of Jesus with a donkey in his works To the Nations and Apology, where he strongly counters such pagan mockery of Jesus. Furthermore, crucifixion was also viewed by the Romans as an extremely dishonourable and shameful way for any person to die, and was therefore reserved for only the lowliest of criminals who were not Roman citizens. This depiction is clearly intended as a double insult to Jesus and his followers. This graffito is also the earliest known depiction of Jesus Christ crucified that has been found so far. The Greek inscription below the image reads, Alexamenos worships his God. It is apparent that Alexamenos was being publicly mocked for his belief in and worship of Jesus Christ as God, and the fact that he was crucified. This graffito, from an obviously hostile and non-Christian source, shows that the worship of Jesus Christ as God by Christians, and that he was crucified, was obviously well known within the city of Rome by the 2nd century AD, even amongst those who clearly did not believe that Jesus Christ was God.
So the pedagogium, whichever it is, was a school for slaves, and it was destroyed before 200 AD. So it was built around 100, destroyed. So we was sometime between 100 and 200 when we don't know exactly when it was put up, but we know when the building, because we have when it was dedicated, and we know when it fell. So bottom line is that this dates between 1 and 200 AD. What this is important, because this isn't Christians saying that we believe Jesus is God. This tells you that in Rome, it was well known that Christians worship Jesus as God. This was by the enemies of Christians. So what this is like this is like super strong evidence. Yeah, it was not just a little secret. It wasn't one of those, well, there were a small sect of Christians that believed Jesus was God. This was very wide known. Everybody that knew about Christians, they call them the Asinarian because they worshiped the god, the donkey thing, right? You know, it was very pejorative. They were very hostile towards Christianity. And they all knew they worshiped Jesus as their God. So her claim that this belief evolved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, the original Christians didn't believe that. It not only has no merit, it's stupid. In light of archaeology today, in light of where we are today, there is no place for this stupid claim. All right, yeah.
As a psychiatrist, and see her trying to convince herself more.
Well, I think that most evangelical atheists have that. There's no way you can be 100% convinced of your whoppers. So there's an insecurity there. And so, yes, I do think that in light, methinkest thou protestest too much. So I agree with you. Yeah. So in summary, we have the Pauline epistles, which talk about the deity of Christ, written in the 50s, just 15 years after the fact. We have the John Rollins manuscript, which dates to around 120 AD, which is 90 years. And it shows no evidence of any transformation of any scribes adding words to make Jesus sound like more than he was. All right. The Megiddo mosaic, which is a mosaic that dates to around 200 or maybe less, where we have the believers literally writing in stone that Jesus is God. Okay, 200 AD. And then the Alexamenos graffiti, which could have been written as early as the early 100s up to 200. Once again, where outside sources are recognizing that Christians worship Jesus as God. So this idea that this was an evolutionary thing, that the belief that Jesus was just a promotional speaker or a good guy or just a prophet but not God, and that Christians was never worshiping as God, not the original Christians. Oh no. Oh yes, the original Christians worship Jesus as God. The evidence is very strong, and there is no valid reason at all to suggest that this belief has evolved. It is absurd and extremely difficult to support. They cannot make a case for this. Okay? All right. Any questions?